Chapter 14. The basketball goals and volleyball net were assembled and already getting broken in by the teens at the center. Judging from the cheering coming from the spectators on the sidelines, everyone was having a good time watching the teens compete against each other. Seeing Mike, Nick went over and thanked him for coming through with the sports equipment, compliments of his father-in-law. While they talked, Nick spotted Chase and Ripa engaged in a lengthy kiss out in the hallway. The public display was a reminder of the kiss he had shared with Michelin earlier.
Sheriff Moran.
Ripa's mother, Lexi Carey, waved as she hurried over to him.
Hello, Miss Carey.
Nick said, wishing he could have avoided running into the woman.
I saw you come in.
Lexi gushed.
And I just had to come over and tell you how happy I am that your Chase and my Ripa have decided to tie the knot. Chase is such a good boy.
She went on.
Tie the knot.
Nick wasn't sure if he'd heard her right.
Didn't Chase tell you that he proposed and Ripa accepted?
Mrs. Carey, you can't possibly think that Chase and your daughter are getting married anytime soon. They're only 17 years old.
Wilbur and I got married when we were only 17, and we're coming up on our 17th wedding anniversary.
Congratulations.
Nick said, trying to sound genuinely happy for her.
Just think about it. When our kids are married, we'll be family.
She said, placing her hand upon his shoulder with a big, happy grin.
That would be something. Would you please excuse me?
Nick said, stepping away to go pry Chase and Ripa apart. On the way home, Nick tried to figure out a way to approach the matter on the engagement without driving a bigger wedge between him and Chase. The only thing working in Nick's favor was the fact that Chase wasn't getting married today or tomorrow, or even next week, despite Lexi Carey's enthusiasm on the subject. Therefore, he could let the matter set for a while, at least until after tomorrow. As the hours drifted into the early evening, Nick couldn't help but notice that Chase looked as if he'd had other more pressing matters on his mind than the beans and franks Nick threw together for dinner. Pushing it aside for now, Nick changed into a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, and then rushed back to the station to pick up Howard for his meeting with Rex Skinner at Sylvie and John's house. Nick pulled into the alley behind the Westons' house.
You've got to be kidding.
Howard scoffed.
Come on.
Nick said, securing the gun in his holster and getting out of the car.
Aren't you going to take these off?
Howard asked, shutting the car door with his elbow.
I'll take them off when we get inside.
Nick said, coming around the car.
Here.
He added, taking his jacket and covering Howard's cuffs to hide them.
Yeah, like that's a lot better.
Howard said, his sarcasm rang loud and clear.
Let's go.
Nick said as he and Howard went around to the front of the house. Stepping up on the porch, Nick knocked.
I'll do the talking. You just make the deal look convincing to Rex. Got it? I got it.
Howard said. The door east opened slightly. John peered out from the small opening. Seeing it was a sheriff, he swung the door open wider and beckoned for them to hurry inside. Understanding the man's apprehension, Nick stepped in as Howard followed. Sylvie's silence toward Howard didn't stop her from keeping a disapproving eye on him. Howard had very little to say to her as well. It was probably his guilt kicking in, Nick told himself.
Sheriff, I don't mean to complain, but how long is this going to take?
John asked.
As soon as the deal is made, I'll make the arrest.
Nick told him. Nick removed Howard's handcuffs, leaving enough time for the imprint to fade. Afterward, he went over what was going to happen once Howard received the merchandise to ensure there were no slip-ups. There was a light tap at the door.
Go to the other room.
Nick told John and Sylvie.
Howard, you stand at the door.
Nick ordered with his gun in place and his back against the wall, where he could watch Howard and listen to the conversation between him and Rex. Sylvie and John disappeared into the other room as Howard opened the door.
You got the stuff?
Nick heard Howard ask. The man was careful not to answer. Howard reached through the door and pulled in a shoebox-sized package. Nick, expecting the drop-off to be more impressive, gestured for Howard to lift the lid so he could see inside.
What are you doing?
The man asked, taking off running away from the house. Pushing Howard aside, Nick tore out after him. With the man in his sights, Nick grabbed him from around the shoulders and wrestled him to the ground.
Get off of me. What are you doing?
He yelled, struggling to break free.
You're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent.
Nick said, putting the handcuffs around his wrist as he continued reading him his rights. Once he finished, Nick pulled the man to his feet and jerked him around.
What's your name?
Nick demanded.
I'm not saying anything until I speak to my lawyer.
He fumed. Nick escorted him back across the yard and into the house, where he slammed him down in the chair at the table. He reached into the man's pocket and pulled out his ID.
Your name is Thomas Richard Skinner.
Nick read the name aloud.
He goes by Rex.
Howard said, standing at a safe distance by the kitchen sink.
You're dead, Keeley.
Rex glared.
Who are you working for? I'm self-employed.
Feeling that he had taken up enough of the Westons' hospitality, Nick phoned Fisk, who was all too willing to pick up both men and take them down to the station. He said something about it being a slow night and that he needed something to do. Nick assured him that they were in for a long night. After booking him, Nick granted Rex his one phone call. Within the hour, a shady-looking man arrived claiming to be Rex's attorney. It was Nick's assumption that Rex Skinner was deeper involved in the case than Howard, on account that Rex was able to afford legal counsel, even if it was from a dodgy character like Donovan Pierce. From what Nick had read online, Donovan had been disbarred from practicing law in California and was now practicing law in the state of Texas. Rex and Donovan spoke long enough to devise some kind of strategy for his release, while Fisk sat across the office, keeping a sharp eye on them both. Once Rex and Howard were locked in their cells, Nick turned to Fisk.
You are on guard. I'll be back first thing in the morning,
he said before leaving. As promised, Nick walked into the office bright and early the following morning. There sat Fisk, nodding off at his desk.
How'd it go last night?
Nick said, setting a white foam tray and a cup of coffee on his desk in front of him.
It went okay.
Fisk said, reveling in the aroma of maple syrup, hash browns, and sausage.
Have some breakfast. When you're done, you can take the rest of the morning off. You sure you don't mind?
Fisk asked, gazing down at the food.
If I need anything, I'll call. In that case, good night, Sheriff. And thanks for the breakfast. Good night, Fisk.
Nick chuckled as Fisk wrapped up the foam tray and cup and took them with him. Nick's phone rang. He picked up the handset and answered.
This is Sheriff Nick Moran.
He paused.
Good morning. This is William Quarter, Senior Director of the Special Investigations Division. I'm returning your call. What can I do for you?
He asked as if he was in a rush.
Thanks for returning my call. I have a situation regarding one of your agents.
Nick said, giving the specifics of the situation from his standpoint, which took nearly 20 minutes. Nick wasn't sure what he'd hoped to accomplish from the call. He only knew that if Brett Auger was planning to come and take over the lives of the citizens of Callahan, Nick had to say he did everything he could to stop him. Later that morning, Nick watched Donovan issue a petition to the judge to reduce Rex's $50,000 bail. It wasn't that Nick thought Judge Strader would consider it, but he had to admit it was interesting watching Donovan try.
I've heard the arguments presented by both defense and opposing counsel. It has been recorded that the defendant pleads not guilty of the crime in which he is accused. I find the defendant, Thomas Richard Skinner, able to stand trial. Regarding defense counsel's petition for bail reduction, it is the court's decision that the motion be denied. A trial date will be set 3 months from today. Mr. Skinner is remanded to Seton Correctional Facility, where he will await his trial. Next case,
Judge Strader said, striking the gavel. Nick headed back to the station, feeling satisfied in a victory that was short-lived. Having come into the lobby, he saw Brett Auger waiting to speak with him.
Good afternoon, Sheriff.
Brett grinned.
Good afternoon.
Nick said, once again forcing himself to be civil.
I was hoping you could spare some time to speak with me.
Brett said. Had Nick not been hoping to see Michelin, he would have taken longer to return. Seeing Brett at the station instead of Michelin was nothing short of disappointing.
What can I do for you?
Nick said, sitting down at his desk. Brett claimed the chair across from him.
I think you know why I'm here.
Brett said in his usual smug tone.
I told you before, we have some leads that we're following. Aside from that, I really don't know what you're expecting me to tell you. You know exactly what I'm expecting to hear, Sheriff. And from the sound of it, you haven't made any more progress than you did the first time we spoke. No, we've made progress. I'm just not at liberty to discuss that progress with you. May I ask why? To my understanding, Agent Stone provides you with an update on the case every evening. I would think that is sufficient. Since the two of you are working together, your report needs to be included with Agent Stone's. The less people know about this case, the better chance I have of solving it. For that reason, I don't share the evidence uncovered with anybody outside of Agent Stone. Then you leave me no choice.
Brett said, getting up and heading to the door.
The threat you made about shutting down Callahan's business would be the wrong choice.
Nick said, stopping him in his tracks.
Oh, and why is that?
Brett turned back, facing him.
According to William Quarter, you don't have authority to do that. When did you speak to Will?
Brett cracked a smile as he slowly returned.
This morning.
Nick said, trying to sound just as confident as Brett.
According to Will, since Agent Stone is cooperating with you, no other measures need to be taken. I see.
Brett chuckled.
So you went over my head. You left me no choice. If that's the way Will wants it, so be it. I'm glad we could come to an agreement. Absolutely. I'll let you get back to work.
Brett smirked as he motioned to leave.
Oh, before I forget,
He said, taking something out of his pocket. He brought it over and placed it on Nick's desk.
What's this?
Nick stared down at the small gold hoop earring.
Michelin lost it the other night. She'll be happy to know I found it.
Brett said before he turned and left. Did this earring really belong to Michelin, or was it a cheap trick on Brett's part to get under Nick's skin? Either way, it was working. Throughout the remainder of the afternoon, Nick found himself wondering if Michelin's ears were pierced, and would she even wear such a thing? It clearly wasn't her, but then again, neither was the lime shell she wore the other day. Who knew what other uncharacteristic articles of clothing and accessories she possessed? At 2:50 p.m., Nick found himself thinking about his conversation with Brett as he sat across the street from Haysdale High School. As much as he disliked the fact that Jacob Larson was involved with this case and knew his son, Nick found himself hating the idea of Michelin lying about loving him when she was obviously involved with Brett. But that couldn't have been right. He told himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Nick watched from a safe distance as Howard approached the school and went around to the side of the building where he stood, waiting. Occasionally, Nick would look down at his watch and then back up at the door. If something was going to happen, it had to happen now to avoid making Howard too conspicuous. Just then the door opened, reminding Nick of the drop-off Michelin witness last week. Nick couldn't help wonder if Howard and the man at the door were the same two people she saw. The only problem was, the man who stood at the door wasn't a teenager. He looked more like a faculty member. Nick reared forward to get a better look. Howard said very little before handing the man the fake package. Had this been any place other than Chase's school, Nick wouldn't have hesitated to make an arrest, but he needed to know what exactly he was dealing with to avoid making a mistake. Nick got out and approached the school, meeting Howard halfway just in case he decided to run. But not having anywhere else to go was enough to make him return to the car. Nick put the cuffs back on Howard's wrists and shut the door. As Howard settled into the back seat.
The man you met wasn't Scully. Who was he?
Nick asked, looking at Howard through the rearview mirror.
I don't know his name. I just know that sometimes I meet with either him or Scully. That guy's pretty cool. He brings in a lot of kids. Is he a teacher? I don't know. He just works there.
The bell rang as the students emptied out into the parking lot to board the school buses. Nick intended to be gone before school dismissed. If Chase was having trouble with some of the kids because he was sheriff's son, Nick didn't want to make matters worse by being there, especially now that he knew a teacher or some authority figure in his school was involved. Nick pulled away from the curb and drove off.
Would you be able to recognize him if you saw a picture of him?
Nick asked.
Yeah, sure. What happens after you make the drop-off at the school? I told you. I get the merchandise from Rex. I take it to the school and drop it off to that guy or Scully. They have some kids who sell the merchandise. They get their cut, we get the rest. We? Who are you talking about? I'm not naming any more names. Okay, so where's Rex getting the merchandise? Is he the top guy involved? All I know is that purchases are made, with fake money, and we're selling the merchandise for profit on the streets. Were drugs a part of it? Yeah, a big part. Where are you getting the drugs? On the south side. Rex has connections. He knows a guy who hooks us up. Well, when you're ready to name names.
Nick said, pulling into his space at the station.
Maybe we can talk about a deal.
It was shortly after 6 o'clock when Nick found himself at Michelin's door. It was his intention to ask her about the earring that Brett claimed she left behind, instead of coming right out with the accusations. That approach, he learned, never worked in matters of the heart. The door opened. There she stood, surprised to see him.
Nick, hi. I was on my way out to get a bite to eat.
I guess this could have waited until tomorrow.
Nick said, hoping that she'd invite him in.
No, it's fine. Come in.
She said, holding the door open for him.
Do you care for something to drink? I have some apple juice.
She chuckled, pointing to the mini refrigerator in the corner of the room.
No, I'm fine.
He smiled.
Okay.
She said, waiting for him to state the reason for his visit.
Oh, I completely forgot. Did you catch Rick Skinner?
That's right. You and I haven't had the chance to talk.
How'd it go?
Michelin asked, encouraging him to have a seat in the chair while she took the seat across from him on the bed. Seeing Michelin clad in a lavender tank top and a pair of jeans with her hair pulled back in a ponytail, Nick couldn't help but wonder if he knew her at all. Obviously, she was one way when it came to her professional life, and another way when it came to her personal one. But wasn't everyone? The only problem Nick had was whether her professional life involved him, while her personal life involved Brett.
Nick?
Michelin asked, cutting into his thoughts.
I'm sorry, what?
I said, how did it go?
Oh,
He paused, trying to focus.
we caught him. Right now, Rex is in custody at Seton until his trial.
That's great news.
The warmth of her smile had a stimulating effect on him that he wanted to ignore.
You should be happy, but you're not, and I think I know why.
Michelin said, tilting her head to the side, revealing the long, sexy slope of her neck that was begging to be kissed.
I owe you an apology for trying to keep you from doing your job the other day.
Oh, that.
He said, quietly with a chuckle.
Is something else bothering you?
She looked puzzled. Unable to stand it any longer, Nick reached into his pocket and pulled out the earring.
I believe this belongs to you.
He said, placing the small golden item in her hand.
I've been looking for that.
Her face brightened.
Where'd you find it?
She asked, looking up at him. Nick would have rathered that the earring been something she'd never seen before. Then he would have known that Brett had lied. But seeing the relief on her face left him deflated.
Brett gave it to me. He said you left it the other night. He thought you might want it back.
Nick had barely finished his sentence before the laughter bubbled up from her throat.
What's so funny?
Nick asked, failing to see the humor.
I lost this about a year ago. I can't believe he held on to it.
What are you saying?
I'm saying that Brett and I weren't together the other night. I don't know why he tried to make you think we were.
I asked you before, and I'm asking you again. Were the two of you ever lovers?
No.
She said, walking over to the window where she stood with her back facing him.
It's none of my business.
Nick felt it necessary to tell her.
If you don't want to talk about it, you really don't have to.
Michelin turned back to him.
Brett and I saw each other outside of work at one time. We dated. Things didn't work out. I tried to end it. End of story.
Tried? What does that mean?
I thought about putting in a request for a transfer, but I didn't want my file showing my reason for leaving, so I stayed.
So you knew why he threatened to shut Callahan down?
I didn't want to assume.
Are you really going to stand there and tell me it never crossed your mind?
It did, all right? Look, when I came to Callahan, I had a case to investigate. I did not know that you and I would start having feelings for each other. And I was having enough trouble trying to explore those feelings without dragging my past relationship with Brett into it.
But he would have tried to hang me out to dry.
Nick got up and came over to her.
And you pretended to not know why.
I'm sorry. I was wrong. I should have told you.
Tell me this. Your relationship, why did you want out?
Because during the 7 months we were together, he failed to mention he was married.
Do you still love him?
No. Do you still love your ex-wife?
She snapped back.
I love the person she used to be.
He said, overlooking the point she was trying to make.
I love the life we had. When I'm thinking clearly and I'm not feeling sorry for myself, I focus on that. I don't think about how her leaving hurt. These past 4 years, I've done what I could to move past that, so I could give my kids the life they deserve. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Brett and I don't have the history that you and Susan have.
Michelin walked back over to the bed.
I know that we have some things to talk about. My leaving, for example.
If you don't mind, I was wondering if we could put this conversation aside for now.
He said quietly. The look in his eyes clearly said what he wanted to happen between them. She felt it too. There was nothing between them now but their desire to please each other, mixed with the timid uncertainty of whether it was a line they should cross. The only thing Nick knew with every fiber of his being was that he wanted her. Even when he disliked everything about her, he wanted her. A feeling he had convinced himself was just lust had slowly evolved into something much more. All those nights he'd lie awake, envisioning her like this, left him tossing and turning, restless with pent-up need, aching to be released. And now she had given him the chance to prove that he was ready to love her with everything he possessed. It had been a long time for Nick, but even that wasn't enough to keep him from throwing himself into the unplanned but necessary moment that simmered to a throbbing pinnacle of unbridled spasms that left them panting breathlessly in each other's arms. Nick pulled away and lifted her chin with his fingertips, meeting the trusting depths of her gaze.
Tell me you love me.
I love you, Michelin.
Hearing the sincerity in the words he spoke, Michelin smiled. The clock on the nightstand read 7:48, making it way later than Nick wanted it to be. He sighed deeply.
Your children are waiting for you,
she said, not that he needed to be reminded.
I know. Will I see you at the office tomorrow?
only if you promise things aren't going to be terribly awkward between us.
It won't be any more awkward than it was before.
She laughed, as did Nick. By the time Nick pulled into the driveway, it was 8:15. Feelings of guilt washed over him for choosing to spend time with Michelin instead of his children. He owed Chase and Allie every minute of his day that he could spare. He saw so little of them as it was. No wonder Chase asked Ripa to marry him. The boy was probably trying to make a family for himself since his own family had been pulled apart. Nick unlocked the door and went inside. There sat Allie on the sofa watching television.
Hi, Daddy,
she said, running over and giving him a hug.
Hi, Allie.
Nick said, squeezing her tightly.
Miss Duffy said you have to sign a note.
Allie said, pulling away as her smile faded.
And why do I have to sign a note from Miss Duffy?
Nick asked, bracing himself for her answer.
Because Jenny Martin is a stupid jerk.
Allie, I told you not to call people names.
Even if those are the only words to describe them.
She stared back at him.
Why don't you start from the beginning?
Nick sighed, taking his place on the sofa as Allie took her place beside him.
All right,
Allie said, taking a deep breath.
Today, Jenny Martin took my pencil. Then she said I was lying when I told her that pencil was mine. Daddy, she started fussing louder and louder until Miss Duffy made us both put our heads down at recess. And when Miss Duffy left the room, Jenny came over and said she wanted to fight me after school.
Did you tell Miss Duffy?
No, Daddy, I couldn't be a tattletale.
So what happened?
I told Kaylee that we had to run to Miss Gunther's car after school, but Jenny caught up with us. She grabbed me and pushed me down on the playground and tore my pants because Kaylee runs too slow.
Nick felt his temper flaring at the thought of some bully pummeling his daughter on the playground.
Are you okay, Allie?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Do I need to have a talk with Mr. and Mrs. Martin?
Chase took care of it.
What did he do?
I told Chase about it when he came to pick me up from Miss Gunther's. That's when he went to Jenny's house and gave her a really firm talking to. After that, he promised that Jenny wasn't going to bother me again. And guess what? She gave me back my pencil.
Allie said as Nick laughed.
I'm glad it worked out for you. So, have you eaten?
Chase made us some bologna sandwiches and soup. I'm stuffed. Now, shh,
she whispered, putting her little finger to her lips.
The show's back on.
Nick looked at the screen. Sure enough, the commercial break was over.
Okay, I'll go check on Chase,
he said, ruffling her hair as she giggled playfully. Nick went down the hall and knocked on Chase's door. As usual, he could hear the bass from the music out in the hall.
Hey, Dad.
Chase called out. Nick opened the door and walked in. He was surprised to see that Chase had done some cleaning. His laundry was inside the basket in the closet, and his bed was made. What had gotten into him? Nick wondered.
Hey, Dad.
Chase sat leaning back in his chair with his textbook open, as though he had been reading. But Nick doubted that any of it was sinking in because of the music.
Chase.
Nick began, not knowing whether to start with his and Ripa's impending engagement or the incident with Allie.
Do you have a minute? Yeah, what's up?
Chase turned off the music.
Allie told me about the trouble she had at school today.
Nick thought it was best to start there. He took a seat on the bed.
She said you straightened out things with the other girl. You're not angry, are you? Why would I be angry? From the sound of it, you were there for your sister. I know Allie and I don't always agree on things, but I just can't let somebody push you around. It surprised me to hear that you stepped up the way you did. I guess I always thought you would. I'm glad to see I was right. Thanks, Chase.
Chase grinned with a nod. Nick, thinking it was best to leave the rest of it alone, for now, got up and headed for the door.
Isn't there something else you want to ask me?
Chase asked. Nick stopped in his tracks with his hand on the knob. Could he find it in himself to leave as if he hadn't heard him? Nick confronted criminals every day, most of the time, without giving it a second thought. But what made him uncomfortable was the confrontations he usually had with Chase. That's when he needed the real courage. Turning around, Nick slid his hands down into the pockets of his pants.
What else is there?
He asked in an attempt to buy himself some time when all he was doing was delaying the inevitable.
Lexi Carey told you about me and Repa getting married.
Chase said, finally closing his book.
She mentioned it.
Nick said, returning to his place on the bed.
Why didn't you say anything? What should I have said? I don't know. I just thought you'd want to talk about it like you do everything else. I was waiting for you to tell me. I figured getting married is something adults do, and an adult would have told his dad about his decision. I am an adult. Is this when I remind you that you're only 17? See?
Chase laughed, shaking his head.
That's why I didn't want to tell you. Okay, but tell me this. When are the two of you plan to make this official? After graduation. Look, Dad, I know you're going to say we're too young, and that we have the rest of our lives to make that decision. No, what I was going to say is, how does this fit into your plans to join the Army? What?
Chase's face twisted in confusion.
The Army, remember? Is what you told your Uncle David you were thinking about doing. I don't know. I was just talking. Besides, Uncle David didn't take me seriously any more than you are right now. I think you're serious. From what I heard that night, you'd do pretty much anything to get out of this house, or even Callahan for that matter. Dad, don't take this personally. I just want to be free. And you think getting married is going to make you free? I love Ripa, and she loves me, and nothing you say is going to change my mind. Chase, you're going to have a lot of choices to make in life. I just don't want to see you make a choice now that's going to limit your choices later.
Nick said, patting Chase on the shoulder as he left, closing the door behind him.